Leviticus chapter 24, and I'll begin reading in verse 17. Where he says, "If a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. The one who takes the life of an animal shall make it good, life for life. If just as he has done, be done to him from. The penalty for if you injure someone, the punishment was to fit the crime. It could be done equally back to you. Now that was intended to spell out the maximum penalty in the law. And it really ensured that the punishment would fit the crime. That number one, that there would be a punishment, but also number two, that it wouldn't be a punishment that exceeded what it needed to make sure that someone didn't do something minor, for instance, cause just a minor fender bender, and then they end up getting sued for $500,000 over something that really was very minor. And so it made sure that the punishment actually fit the crime. And now this was intended to be a guide for the court system, but not to sanction personal vengeance. And the goal of it was to bring about justice, not vengeance. And just historically speaking, by Jesus' day, it was almost never used literally. For instance, if someone knocked out someone else's tooth, they wouldn't go to the court and they say, okay, you get to knock his tooth out. There would be some type of monetary payment that would come for it that would be decided by the courts. But again, the idea would be that the punishment would fit the crime. The problem, however, was that in Jesus' day, the Jewish leaders weren't really very merciful people. And we read as Jesus is really laying into the scribes and Pharisees, those who were the teachers of the law. In Matthew chapter 23 and verse 23, he says to them, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others." One of the things they lacked was mercy and justice. You see, it wasn't so much about doing what's right as it was about getting what I can get. And as we'll see as we continue to go through the Sermon on the Mount in the coming weeks, they were more interested in putting on appearances and seeing what others thought of them, or making sure that their reputation was good, more than they were interested in making sure that their character was good. They weren't really all that interested in mercy or in justice. But whenever they were wronged, this law was used more for vengeance than it was for doing what was right. The law wasn't designed to sanction vengeance, but it was being used in that way. It had become all about what they could get out of someone or what punishment they could inflict on their opponent, rather than justice. Rather than going to see that justice was done in order saying, this is what has to happen in order to set things right, it spelled out in their minds the maximum punishment of, well, you know what? Here's what I get to inflict on you. Rather than looking for what's actually going to make this situation right, or as close as possible to setting things right. Because you see, the goal really ultimately should be justice. But that's where we see what Jesus taught in this situation. "But I say to you," verse 39, "do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Do not resist an evil person." Now, he's not saying that we shouldn't be opposed to what's evil. It's the idea of what we read earlier from Romans chapter 12. Don't return evil for evil. We're not to stoop to their level, and we'll see that as we look at some other passages as well. But don't do what comes naturally, and what comes naturally is to fight back, to look for revenge. You know, as our society says, revenge is a dish best served cold. Wait until it's not expected. Wait until you can get the most satisfaction out of it. Don't do what comes naturally. If someone hits you, the temptation is, well, I want to hit them harder. If someone insults me, I'm going to insult them and probably their family too. That's what comes naturally. But that's not the standard of Jesus. You see, he calls us to a higher standard. He calls us to a different way of thinking. And as we've already looked at this morning, I want to look at again Romans chapter 12, verses 17 through 21. Because I think this one bears repeating because it fits so well with what Jesus is saying in this section. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Leave room for God to take care of vengeance. Leave room for Him to make sure things are set right. Our place is to see to it that we can live as much as it depends on us, Paul says, at peace with others. Even those who do us wrong, even those who insult us, even those who would try to hurt us, even those who might, as we see in the examples, might physically assault us or try to legally take things away from us. Try to, as much as we can, live at peace with them and allow God to make sure that everything is handled justly in the end. But don't stoop to the level of those who mistreat you. God calls us to a higher standard than that. But as we consider the teachings of Jesus, as so many cases, and we've not really looked at this in the Sermon on the Mount up to this point very much, but I want to call our attention to 1 Peter chapter 2. Because Jesus teaches a lot of wonderful things here in the Sermon on the Mount, but what we see in this case is that Jesus does not just teach that we behave this way. He sets the example in it as well. Jesus doesn't just say, do as I say. He says, follow my example. Do as I do. He sets the perfect example in following his own teachings. Excuse me. In 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 21, for you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Jesus set the example to the greatest degree of what it means to not return evil for evil. Literally, to the people who were killing him, he didn't say anything ugly back to. Rather, while he was hanging on the cross, you remember what he said? He didn't insult them. He didn't call on the Father to rain down fire from heaven on them. He said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Now, if Jesus can do that, I don't think it's much of a stretch for us to be able to bear up under maybe a few insults or ugly words sometimes. He set an example for us that goes far beyond what we've had to put up with, what we've had to deal with in someone being ugly toward us. And he didn't just teach it. He gave us an example of what it looks like. But in our text, he uses several illustrations to make this point in what it looks like to not to react naturally whenever someone treats us poorly. And the first one being, whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. An example, if someone assaults you, if someone hits you. And in this case, it's a particularly insulting way to hit, because historically what he would have been talking about, and if you spend some time looking at this, pretty much everyone that's dug into this is in complete agreement that what Jesus is referring to here, slapping on the right cheek, someone using their right hand, would be a slap with the back of the hand. It would be a grave insult. Remember, we talked about Jesus, what Jesus taught earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, about those who are angry, those who have contempt for their brother. That would be an example of showing contempt, slapping someone in that way. But if someone treats you that way, turn your other cheek to them. The tendency is to want to hit back. Getting struck on the right cheek would be more than just getting hit. It would be a terrible insult. But Jesus calls on his followers to maintain a dignity of character. Don't stoop to the same level as those who would behave this way. Don't resort to violence. It would be better to be hit again than to resort to violence in seeking revenge. He goes on, he doesn't just say that the mistreatment would come physically, but maybe legally. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Now, the shirt or the tunic would be the inner garment. The coat or the cloak would be the more substantial outer garment. He's talking about one who would sue you for the less substantial, and what he's saying is, give him the other one too. In Exodus chapter 22, verses 26 and 27, we see the law concerning someone taking a coat from another Israelite. In Exodus 22, beginning in verse 26, he says, if you ever take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you are to return it to him before the sun sets. For that is his only covering, it is his cloak for his body. What else shall he sleep in? It shall come about that when he cries to me, I will hear him, for I am gracious. The cloak, or the outer, more substantial garment, could not be taken away permanently by law. What Jesus is saying, if someone takes your inner garment, give them the more important one too. Give more than what's being asked. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, we read about an instance in a church that was really struggling to get along with one another. They were divided over a number of things. They were divided over who was their favorite messenger. They were divided over a number of different things, and one of those being that this church, there were members that were suing one another. And he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, beginning in verse 7, actually then it's already a defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? On the contrary, you yourselves wrong and defraud. You do this even to your brethren. If someone takes you to court to take something away from you, give them more than what they're asking for. Overcome evil with good. Rather than fighting against brothers and sisters, it's better to just accept the wrong. He talks about being wronged by being hit, by being taken to court. And the next one he talks about is one that would have likely frustrated anyone that had to deal with it, because in the Roman Empire, the Roman soldier could come along, and as he's carrying his things on the road, if he decided he wanted someone else to carry his things, he could grab a citizen and say, you're going to carry my things. And he could compel, by law, a citizen to carry his things. Someone there, he could compel by law someone to carry his things for a mile. They were compelled to serve. This is exactly in Luke chapter 23, whenever it says that Jesus was led away to crucifixion, and it says that Simon the Cyrene was given the cross of Christ, given the cross of Jesus to carry there with him. That's exactly the law that they used to compel Simon to carry the cross. But if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Don't simply do the minimum. And I'm sure those who were compelled to do that sort of thing, there was probably some grumbling and complaining and disputing and really being frustrated about having to do such a thing. And Jesus says, don't just do the minimum, go further. Do more than what's required of you. And to those who ask, give. Don't turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Now, this sometimes would mean having generosity exploited. But as Jesus is commenting on what the standard of God's people is to be, he's really just going along with what the law of Moses already said. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, beginning in verse 7, the law commanded the Israelites to be generous with one another, to be generous to the needy. In Deuteronomy 15, beginning in verse 7, he said, if there's a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor close your hand from your poor brother, but you shall freely open your hand to him and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need and whatever he lacks. Beware that there is no base thought in your heart, saying the 7th year is near, the year of remission, and your eye is hostile towards your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he may cry to the Lord. He may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be sin in you. You shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy, and the poor in your land. And Jesus is simply reiterating that principle to the one who asks of you, give. If someone is in need, give. If someone needs to borrow, give. And what the law of Moses is referring to there as well, he said, don't be hostile in your thinking, well, the 7th year is near, and on the 7th year, the debts would be canceled. And so there'd be the temptation, someone wants to borrow something, well, if it's getting close enough, I won't have to pay it back. The standard of the law and the standard that Jesus is calling his people to is be generous anyway. Give to those who are in need, and it's the kind of generosity that we see in Acts chapter 2 of the church, giving to anyone who had need, distributing to make sure that no one was in need. The temptation is when someone asks to be skeptical. The temptation is when someone hits us to hit back. When someone tries to get something from us to resist, and maybe to try to turn it around. But Jesus says, look out for the good of your neighbors. Do good even to those who are doing evil to you. Jesus is teaching about the desired attitude that we're to have. Now we have to be careful that we not understand, because he's not teaching that we're to be a doormat. Because as we see later on in the book of Acts, Paul defended himself and he took advantage of his rights as a Roman. Whenever he was being asked to stand trial before people who wanted to kill him in Jerusalem as a Roman citizen, he said, I appeal to Caesar. He wasn't a doormat, but he didn't return evil for evil. And that's where we have to have a balance, that we not look to do harm to others. But we need to take a look sometimes at what is our natural reaction when someone wrongs us, when someone is ugly to us physically, verbally, emotionally. What's our natural reaction? What do we want to do to them? Do we look for payback? Do we look for revenge? Do we look to pay them back in the same manner? As in so many other areas that we've already seen in the Sermon on the Mount, Christ calls us to a higher standard than that. Just as we read in Romans, the Lord said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Our goal is to do good as much as we can to others, regardless of what they've done. Christ teaches us a higher standard than the world teaches us. Instead of revenge, maybe we should ask, how can we show love to those who behave that way? But just as we saw with Jesus in the way that he didn't seek revenge, he didn't insult, he didn't show any kind of contempt or hatred toward those who were crucifying him. We see the same thing as we consider treating those who would treat us in that way. Because Paul said in Romans chapter 5 that we were once the enemies of God. And it was at that time that Jesus Christ came to this earth. It was at that time that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. And if God can love us in that way, when we were rebellious against him, his enemies, seeking our own ways, seeking after our own selfish desires, he calls us to that same standard as we relate to others. He calls us to treat others the way he's treated us, to be good even when we're treated poorly. We're going to offer an invitation in just a moment. Maybe you find yourself tempted to strike out at others whenever they treat you poorly, We invite you to live by the standard that Christ calls us to. Or maybe this morning you've never become a Christian. You have the opportunity this morning, even though you are in sin, to be forgiven because of the goodness of God, because of the love of God, because He loves us even when we're in sin, and He offers us a way out through Jesus Christ. He offers us forgiveness through Jesus Christ. He offers us fellowship with Himself through Jesus Christ if we'll turn away from a life of sin and be united with Jesus in the waters of baptism. You have that opportunity this morning. If we can help you in some way, would you come while we stand and while we sing?